Welcome to the I Love Negotiating podcast, where we aim to equip you with the practical strategies, techniques, tactics, and tools to dramatically improve your negotiation results. My name is Jan Potgieter. Over the past 15 years, I've consulted to and trained many of the world's leading brands in more than 60 countries to help them improve their business negotiation results. I've trained just under 10,000 people face-to-face in a small group format, and I've negotiated on camera one-on-one with almost 4,000 people from most major cultural backgrounds. In this podcast, I want to use my experience to bring perspective to your negotiation challenges. In this podcast today, I want to give you a reference point to assist you in applying best practices to all your business-related negotiations. What we've done is we've developed a framework based on 4 pillars. So if you will, a framework for business negotiation success. And in the more than 10 years now that I've been specializing in delivering both consulting and training solutions around negotiation best practices within the business context, I've developed a framework to help me to bring across the knowledge and make it easier for people to understand and interact with these best practices and the principles that we've identified through research and study. And in today's episode, I want to pause and explain briefly each one of these 4 pillars so that you have an easily referenceable way to bring best practices into the different phases and stages of your negotiations. So the framework that I'm going to be discussing, the 4 pillars are as follows. The first pillar is the pillar of vision. The second pillar is the pillar of value. The third pillar is the process pillar, and then the fourth and last pillar is what I refer to as the relationship pillar. Now, I'm going to step through each one of these 4 pillars in turn and share with you a glimpse of the elements within each one of those pillars that you need to consider, specifically as you prepare for your negotiations. But of course, you also want to make sure that you reference these pillars during your negotiations and perhaps also reflect on them after your negotiations are finished, so that you can in some way try and establish for yourself a framework so that you can also improve the way that you negotiate. It's interesting that it's been said many times over that you can't improve anything unless you're measuring it. And often people don't know if they're good negotiators or they're bad negotiators. This is what I find as I go around the world and I provide negotiation training interventions. I often tell people the most value that I can bring to them is to bring them perspective, because I've literally negotiated with thousands of people and I've provided feedback to thousands of people in the context of how they can improve their negotiations. And probably one of the main points that always strike me is that it's really difficult to understand whether you're a good or a bad negotiator if you've never benchmarked your performance. If you don't know what it takes to be a good negotiator, how do you know if you're a good negotiator? And if you use these 4 pillars that I'm going to share with you as a reference point so that you can establish how you perform on a consistent basis, well, then in the first instance, you've got a way to start measuring your performance, because if you use these 4 pillars and you say, I refer to these 4 pillars and the way that I perform each time that I negotiate with reference to these 4 pillars, well, then you have a common reference point and perhaps something that you can use to start measuring your performance. You might say, look, I didn't do really well as measured against the first pillar today, but maybe I did really well when I look at the second and third pillar, and so forth. So what I want to do is talk you through each one of these pillars, and then we'll see how you can make sure that you apply these in a way consistently so that you can optimize your outcome. So the first pillar of vision. All relationships begin with a common vision or desire at some stage. We also know that, and we take this from marriage counseling, we know that relationships primarily break down because there's no shared vision in place anymore. People will suffer a lot of pain, will go through a lot of effort if they believe that they're going the same place in the same direction as their partner, counterpart, whatever you want to call it. If we're headed in the same direction and we believe we have the same end goal in sight, it becomes much easier for us to deal with the things that we don't like. Now, often in the context of negotiation, it is really, really hard to reach agreement with somebody who's going in completely the opposite direction from you. This is why we talk about understanding people's interests, the things that sit behind the positions that they assume. So the things that really motivate them. And it's a great place to start, even though negotiation is not linear and sequential. Remember in the previous episode we spoke about how negotiation is complex rather than complicated, and therefore not linear and sequential. It's still a great place to start, because if you will, we start with the big picture. So we try to understand where people are headed, what their key interests are, what the key things are that they wish to get as a result from negotiating with you. So within the pillar of vision, there are a few things that we consider. So number one, we consider interests. What are the things that motivate people? Number two, how does that then lead us to form a strategy for the negotiation? Now, in my experience, over the last 10 years, 99.9% of negotiators don't think or consider a strategy before they go into negotiation. It seems that most folks, aside from those who are really, really successful, just kind of approach negotiations from a tactical perspective rather than a strategic perspective. You know, this is the difference if you think also about the difference between some of the large corporations in the world and many small businesses. I've heard it said, I attended a seminar recently, that most big businesses, particularly the big retail businesses, they know exactly what they're going to do in terms of their marketing for the next 12 months. But when you ask 99.9% of small business owners what they're going to be doing marketing-wise for the next 12 months, they can't tell you. They're just thinking about what they're going to be doing this week or this month. It's the same thing if we think about the difference in results between the really great negotiators and the many folks out there who just negotiate at an average level. Great negotiators are really good at formulating strategy. They understand exactly how they're going to be approaching this negotiation and what tactics they're going to deploy along the way to assist them in achieving their objectives. So, the first area we said under the pillar of vision is considering interest. The second one is lining up your strategy. And we'll speak more about strategy in forthcoming podcasts. Forthcoming episodes of this podcast. The third element that you want to consider here is tactics. So, you know, the way that you negotiate or the way that you're understood is a function of the perception of your counterpart rather than your intent. So your counterpart will form their opinion based on their perception, irrespective of what you intend or what you mean. So recently we've seen this week the interview between Oprah and Lance Armstrong, and there you can clearly see that the perception, I think, of the public at large and perhaps the host of critics that he has out there of the way that he approached the interview with Oprah, I suspect is very different to what he intended. I suspect he intended to come across quite contrite and apologetic, and I think the way that what he communicated was understood by most is perhaps quite far removed from what his original intent was. We often see this also if you're in a relationship, if you have a spouse or a partner, you will have many reference points to where you've had disagreements where you've said, well, look, that's not what I meant. That's not what I intended. Now, if we don't particularly think about the tactics that we want to use in the negotiation and make sure that those tactics are in line with the strategy that we've selected, we will most definitely not be managing the counterpart's perception. Let me give you an example. Let's say my strategy, my intent is to be truly collaborative in my approach here, but then I use the extreme offer tactic. I start with a particularly high starting point, or I use the bottom line tactic. Then my counterpart is not going to experience my approach as being collaborative. Even though my intent might have been collaborative, their perception of my approach will have been that I've indeed been competitive in my approach. So it's very important we consider first the strategy and then the tactics, so that we can make sure that the tactics line up and support the strategy that we've selected. So that's the first pillar. We've mentioned the first pillar of vision is made up really of three sub-points. Number one, interests. Number two, your strategy. And number three, the tactics which you want to pursue. That brings us to the second pillar, the pillar of value. Now, within the context of the value pillar, we specifically look at two things. Number one, we want to set ourselves specific objectives for the negotiation. So we think about things like the order of priority and the weighting associated to each of the goals that we've set ourselves for the negotiation, or each one of the objectives that we'd like to reach in this negotiation. So let's say, for example, if you're trying to agree on a contract with a supplier, let's say there might be a number of different objectives. One of the objectives might be to get as long a term as possible. So you want the contract to last for 3 years, for instance. Maybe a second objective would be to get the best price possible. Third objective might be to guarantee levels of supply. Fourth objective might be payment terms. So as part of setting up your deal objectives, you want to identify all of these items, and you want to create an order of relative importance for each one of these objectives. And then you want to decide, are they conflicting? Are they shared? You want to associate, or you want to try and identify if there's a zone of possible agreement for each one of these objectives, which means, of course, that you also, by definition, will have to start thinking about the objectives from your counterpart's perspective, because it'll be impossible for you to identify whether there is indeed a zone of possible agreement within the overlap, if you will, of the objectives between, or the objectives as seen from your side versus the objectives as seen from your counterpart's perspective. Which brings us on to the next point, and this is the notion of creativity. It's very important as part of your consideration of the value that you also consider creativity, or bring in creativity into your preparation and engagement process. Very often we start to think creatively, but we do it too late when we find that a deal is not possible anymore, or we're in a deadlock, or we're in a jam. And then we all of a sudden start trying to come up with all manner of creative ideas. What we really should be doing is, as we prepare for our negotiations, as we start getting ready, we should start thinking about creative ways to reach agreement. Now, it's very interesting. A lot of research agrees on this, is that so often the best value is found not on the table, but away from the table. This is why we explore interests, because we understand what really motivates people. Because if we can look past their positions, we can open up all manner of different ways of trying to satisfy those interests. So specifically addressing creativity. So once we look at all these deal objectives, if we identify that it's going to be very difficult for us to reach a deal because the zone of possible agreement is very small, or it maybe doesn't even exist, then that's your cue to really become creative. And there are a number of resources that you can tap into. The bonus 6 thinking hats is a great one to use to help you look at problems from different perspectives. There's also the Disney creativity model, which is favored by many of those who use the discipline of NLP to replicate success. It's a model that was used by or is used by the Disney Corporation to generate, as you would agree, many creative ideas, as evidence through all the shows and the stuff that they've managed to produce. So there are tools that you can use to help you to be creative and not to just always focus on negotiating the obvious. So that's the second pillar, the pillar of value, really made up of those two components. So setting specific deal objectives, and there's a whole science behind how you go about setting objectives, and what levels of opening offers, and how you trade concessions, and all those kind of things. More on that in later episodes. And then the second element under the pillar of value is considering creativity and how you can unlock creativity in your approach to this negotiation. Then that leads us on to the third pillar, the pillar of process. Now, this is the area where we do start to think about maybe some elements that could be linear and sequential in our negotiation process. So I'm not for a minute suggesting that negotiation is linear and sequential in its overall approach, but certainly as we get involved in the face-to-face or telephone-based or communication-based part of the negotiation, as distinct from the preparation phase of negotiation, there are certain things that we can do that will often make sense to structure in a sequential way. For instance, it would be a great idea when you start negotiating to create a frame for the negotiation. So to set the scene, if you will, in such a way that it would optimize the measure of control that you have on that negotiation. So by using an agenda, for instance, which can give you a lot of control as you proceed through the meeting. Another element to consider on the pillar of process is the way that you use questioning to uncover interests and overcome objections. So how might you do that? Another one is how you might approach concession trading. So what are the best practices you can bring to bear in that context? Maybe there's a checklist that you would like to take with you as you go through both your preparation and engagement in negotiations, so that you can make sure that you've addressed or thought about all the elements you need to think about so as to optimize the outcome of that specific negotiation. In one of the future upcoming episodes, we will also cover with you the checklist that we use, the negotiation preparation checklist that we use within the Business Negotiation Academy to assist you to prepare for your negotiations and to make sure that you've covered all those things that can have an impact on the outcome of your negotiations. So, under process, we also look at things like team composition. How do you structure your team so that you don't become the victim of being manipulated from by your counterpart, so that you're not ending up negotiating more amongst yourselves than you are with your counterpart? You know, it can be chaos if you get into negotiations where there are loads of people present. I've been in environments where it's just been, quite frankly, ridiculous because of the lack of structure. That negotiations, you know, certainly before I embarked on my career 10 years ago as a negotiation expert, before I learned about some of these best practices 15, 16 years ago, I remember one meeting where we were doing a large consortium type deal where we literally had maybe about 50 to 60 people in the room to try and reach agreement on kind of a consortium approach to a really big commercial opportunity. And this meeting just dragged on. Literally, we were in there for, I think, about 2.5 days, where we got minimum amount of sleep, maybe 4 hours a night, as we try to hammer out things. And if I only knew then what I knew now, what I know now, that meeting could have been done, I think, in less than a day, and it would have been so much smoother just by bringing the right structure and management criteria, if you will, to both assigning roles and making sure that people contribute in a way that's most effective to getting to agreement in the shortest amount of time. We also want to think about, so the fourth element, so just to recap, under the pillar of process, we've talked about framing, we've talked about questioning, we've talked about preparation process, so using a checklist maybe, we've spoken about team composition, and it's also important that we think about some of the logistical things, so venue setup, food and drink, all those kind of things that would be worth thinking about as we want to support or create an environment that supports the negotiation, which is in line with the strategy that we've selected. So if we decided to be competitive, how do we make sure that the environment supports that? If we, on the other hand, want to be compromising or collaborative, let's make sure we create a negotiation environment, physical environment that's conducive to that kind of negotiation. Okay, so that was the third pillar of process. The last pillar is the pillar focused on relationships. And in this pillar, we really focus on the people, people-centered, more soft-skilled stuff, if you will. So the first thing that we need to consider here is the negotiation climate or the atmosphere, and what influences that. So what are the things that make people feel put at ease? What are the things that, the basic things people need to be satisfied or addressed so as to make them feel included in the process, or how to establish rapport the best way. And there are any number of factors in this context. So things like, body language, how they use space, the power of being politeness, how to claim the moral high ground, or how to occupy the moral high ground. Specifically also considering the principles of persuasive communication. So how is it that you can communicate the what in such a way that it will significantly increase the likelihood of you getting a yes to your requests. So often we focus on the what, and as I've gone around, I see, we have a huge variety of business negotiators with different backgrounds coming through our programs, and we often see folks who are really kind of left-brained and very intellectual, if you will, and they often miss out on the soft skills. So just because they have a high degree of technical or financial competence, they often try to approach arguments based purely on the what, and they don't focus enough on the how. And if you learn anything from medicine, I often use the example. I say, if you want to give kids, any of you that have kids will know this, if you want to get kids to take medicine because they're unwell, they won't take the medicine if it doesn't taste good. This is why if you look at children's medicine, it's all flavored in attractive flavors like strawberry and banana and blackberry and whatever, because people know that unless the medicine tastes good, you're far less likely to take it. So the fact that you might have the world science, or the world scientist, lining up behind you in support of your argument, if you deliver that argument in such a way that it causes offense, it will just build resentment and resistance, and you probably will not get the agreement or the response that you wish to get. So it becomes very important to consider the principles of persuasive communication. And we normally look at Dr. Robert Cialdini's 6 principles in assisting those who come through our training programs to communicate with confidence in such a way as they then will significantly increase the likelihood that their counterparts will say yes to their request by applying the 6 principles of persuasive communication, which include things like liking, authority, commitment, consistency, reciprocity, and so forth. More on this also in future episodes. So those are the 4 pillars of negotiation best practice that we use as a reference point. I haven't been able, within the context of the time available, to go into minute detail on each one of these points, but it would be my intent over the coming weeks and months to break down some of these concepts and principles in such a way as to give you some practical angles that you can deploy immediately, so as to start saving time and money, but also increasing the results of the outcomes in financial terms that you achieve from your negotiations. Also critical for me is that you use these 4 pillars to improve the quality of relationships. So I know we talk about business negotiation, and you might infer that by talking about business negotiation it's all about the money, but it isn't. We know that money is not necessarily what motivates most people. As a matter of fact, we know that money doesn't motivate most people. However, we do find ourselves mostly in business. This is just the society of the world that we live in. Most of us have jobs, and we need to try to earn a living. So earning money and establishing good relationships should not and is not mutually exclusive. So it would also be my desire that you use these 4 pillars to really strengthen the relationships that you have, not only with suppliers or clients, but also with your colleagues and other stakeholders within your business. So let me summarize these 4 pillars. And what I suggest you do is, if you don't have a pen or a piece of paper handy, get a pen, get a piece of paper handy, pause this podcast now, and then continue once you've got a pen and a piece of paper handy. And I'm going to summarize the 4 principles for you. What I suggest you do is that you refer to these 4 pillars as you get ready and you prepare for your next negotiation. So think through each one of these items. So number 1, the pillar of vision. Think about the interests. So what motivates your counterpart as well as what your key motivations are. So quick example, I want $100 for this. The reason I want $100 for this would be the interest. The reason I want the $100 is because I need to pay a bill. My counterpart, maybe the reason why they want what I'm selling might be to increase their productivity. Those are the interests. Secondly, think about the specific strategy you wish to pursue. So there are 5 of them. You can decide to avoid negotiation. You can decide to be accommodating. You can decide to be compromising. competitive, or collaborative. So pick one of those 5. Also think about maybe the strategy your counterpart would be most likely to pursue. Then, thirdly, think about the tactics. What tactics do you want to use to support the execution of this strategy? So there are so many tactics, too many for me to cite here, but make sure that those tactics line up with the strategy that you've selected. Then we look at just summarizing the second pillar for you. That's the pillar of value. 2 things we're going to look at here specifically. So number 1, setting objectives. So make a list of all the objectives that you have for this negotiation. Make a list of all the objectives you think your counterpart has for this negotiation. Categorize them or rank them in order of priority and weighting. So you might say, quality is my top priority, and it probably contributes 70% of the weighting, or the relative importance of all my objectives. And then also think about the objectives from your counterpart's perspective. And once you see both of those in front of you, try to work out if a deal is possible. Is there an overlap? Do these objectives overlap or not? And we call that the zone of possible agreement. Then think about creative things that you can do. Are there things that you can bring to the table that might create new opportunities? Are there things that have been uncovered as a consequence of you looking at the interest of both parties that you think might be worth bringing to the table? Obviously, the smaller the zone of possible agreement that you see in place, the more you will have to rely on being creative to invent options for mutual gain. That brings us to the third pillar. It's the pillar of process. And in this pillar, there are a few things you want to specifically think about. So think about the frame that you can create for this negotiation. So what is your framing statement going to be? How are you going to open things? How are you going to make sure that you use this frame throughout the negotiation consistently? Is there an agenda that you can use to support the communication of your frame? Think about, in the second instance, the questions that you want to ask. We know that asking open questions is by far the best way of uncovering interests. This is a great thing to do early on in negotiation, is to try and at least validate the assumptions that you've made about the interest that your counterpart may have by asking open questions. Things like, what is important to you? Why is it important? And so forth. Then think about this checklist. Hopefully what you're jotting down now, each time that you get ready for your negotiation. Have you considered all the elements that you need to think about? Think about your team composition. Who should be there? General rule of thumb is the fewer people you take in, the better. Have you given people specific roles? How can you make sure that you have an efficient as possible use of everyone's time when you get large amounts of people together to negotiate? Lastly, think about the venue. How can you physically set up the venue or use the venue to support specifically the execution of your negotiation strategy? So if you want to be collaborative, how do you set up a collaborative venue? If you want to be competitive, how do you set up a competitive venue? And so forth. Lastly, the fourth pillar, the pillar of relationships. And as you get ready, think about these things. Think about the negotiation climate. So how can you create an environment, an atmosphere that's conducive to the achievement of your objectives? So focus on being polite. Perhaps you want to make sure everybody has name tags if it's a large group of people that be in the negotiation. You want to ensure that you address people properly in the proper fashion. Depending on where you are in the world, people have different customs. So if you're in Austria, it's very important that you use titles. If you're in the UK, then it's perfectly okay to use people's first name. If you're in Japan, the salutation is completely different. Then you need to approach things much more formally and probably add Sam to person's name. Many of these things that you need to consider as you want to create the climate that best supports the execution of your negotiation strategy. Think about how you can say what you're going to say in such a way as to make it most likely that people will buy from you. Because let's face it, whilst I use the word buy, it doesn't really matter if in a commercial sense you're buying or selling. effectively you're always selling. You're just selling your argument, aren't you? You're selling your view. If you're buying, you're selling your budget. You're selling your justification for people to do things that you're suggesting that they should be doing for the price or for the compensation that you're suggesting they should be doing it for. So this is also a useful frame. Always think that you're trying to sell, you're trying to get people to come over to your side of the line, and that'll help you to focus on how you say things, not just the what. So think about these 6 principles of communication, persuasive communication, that you can use to communicate much more effectively. So there you go. Those are the 4 pillars for your frame of reference. So that's our framework for negotiation success. Over the coming weeks, we'll spend more time going into each one of these ones, into many of these elements in more detail. So this brings me on to the last section before we close off this episode, which is just responding to some comments and questions. Now, I got an interesting question, which is one that I often get as I move around the world, which is, who should be making the first offer? So if you're in a negotiation, should you make the first offer, or should you let your counterpart make the first offer? Now, there's been a lot of debate on this one, and you'll see many different views. And if you look at the experts or the academics' view on this, most people would say that you're better off going ahead and making the first offer. However, when you talk to lots of buyers, they tell you that you're better off waiting for your counterpart to make the first offer. So which one of the two is it? Well, the answer really is that it depends, and it depends on a couple of things. If you have lots of references and precedents available, that'll help you to understand whether you're in a position where you should be waiting for the first offer or going ahead and making the first offer. By means of example, we know that if your perception of your power, your relative power in the negotiation, is that you have less power than your counterpart, we know that we tend to lower our own aspirations. And in that case, making the first offer will play in the hands of your counterpart. So let's say you want to interview for a new job, for a salary negotiation, a job interview, and you're going to have a salary negotiation. What happens 99.9% in an interview situation is that the company will ask you what it is you expect to earn. And they do this because the science tells us that because you will see your level of power as lower than the company's level of power, that first offer that you're going to make will be in the favor of the company, because you will not be as aggressive as perhaps you would have been had you thought that you had more power. In other words, what that means is that instead of the company offering you a level of salary, let's say they were prepared to offer you a level of salary of $80,000, now they ask you what you expect to earn, the odds are that you're going to come up with a number that's lower than what they were prepared to offer to pay you in the first place, because of your perception of the disparate level of power in that negotiation. So the key thing here is to analyze the expected level of power in the negotiation to help you decide whether you should make the first offer or not. So if you have a lot of power, what I would recommend you do is you let your counterpart make the first offer. If you don't have a lot of power, what I'd recommend you do is that you go ahead and make the first offer. However, you make sure that you do not end up negotiating with yourself. When you do make that first offer, when you have less power in the negotiation, make sure that you have an adequate aspirational level associated with that first offer, so that you're still able to make concessions. We'll speak a bit more about offers and concession trading in future episodes of the I Love Negotiating podcast. Next week, in the next episode, I'm going to be speaking to Linda Potgieter, who is my wife, but also my colleague. And Linda has been around the world working with negotiators, both within a business context as well as in a non-profit charitable context. And Linda has a lot of experience specifically around the challenges faced by women within the corporate or business world. And I'm going to be spending some time with her talking through the challenges faced by women in the context of negotiation, and also when men are up against women and women negotiate with other women, what are some of the challenges that are unique to those scenarios, and how can you overcome those? So that's what to look forward to in episode 3 of the I Love Negotiating podcast. So lastly, please do go to ilovenegotiating.com and leave your comments and questions on the site, because I will respond to those within the next episode. So if you have any questions that you wish to ask, post them on the site, and I'll make sure that I respond. Secondly, I would ask that if you're listening to this podcast and you can think of any other people who might benefit from listening to the podcast, go ahead, send them a link. Best of all, subscribe on iTunes. Also go ahead and go to the iTunes page and post a review of the podcast. Tell people if you like it or not. I would appreciate that. So that brings us to the end of the second episode. And the last thing for me to say is, remember to negotiate honestly, and above all, negotiate profitably. Till next time, goodbye.